Sup guys? I made a few changes to my Vanguard tier list, enough to warrant its own video. I'll be highlighting each one and explaining my rationale for each of them. First things first, the ships are the ships and they don't change based on what tier I put them in. Just because a ship was an A tier before and B tier now has no impact on their performance. I just updated my opinion and think it's more appropriate to place them there. I'll begin with the ships that were removed from B tier. Although they're no longer on the tier list, my assessment of their use cases, damage, and survivability has not changed, so if anyone is ever curious about my assessment of them, feel free to go back to the old tier list videos where I talk about why I tiered them in B tier in the first place. There were 3 statistics that I felt like were not special enough to remain on the list. Those being Azuma, Rune, and Friedrich Karl. Of the 3, Rune is the weakest and doesn't really offer anything notable over Friedrich Karl and Azuma, while having less survivability. Azuma and Karl are both solid statistics, but there are a couple of factors holding them back compared to some of the other statistics in the same tier. They are neither the tankiest nor deal the most damage and offer no utility otherwise. On the survivability front, they lose out to the likes of Yat-sen, Felix, and Neptune. In terms of damage, the DDGs, St. Louis, Watarase, Kawakaze, Harbin, all outperform them in most areas, and there are ships that can at least match them like Felix, Hatsuzaki, Neptune, and L'Audacieux. Just to be certain, I tested Neptune against Kronstadt in 13.4. The footage is linked in the description. From previous testing, and also just anecdotal experience, Kronstadt deals noticeably more damage than Azuma, and Neptune with her unique augment, matching Kronstadt's damage, means that she's likely stronger than Azuma as well, while having higher survivability after 2 procs of her zombie heal. On top of Neptune being both stronger and bulkier than Rune, Azuma, and Friedrich Karl, she is also the easiest to obtain, being permanently available and coinable. Destroyers that have similar damage output and survivability are going to have an inherent advantage due to their anti-submarine capabilities, and many of them have other perks too, like Hatsuzaki and Jervis's defensive buff skills. So that's my reasoning for dropping them from the list altogether. Even if I left these 3 on in particular, there is always going to be someone asking why their favorite ship is not on the tier list, despite being approximately as good as them, and this is where I decided to draw the line. Next, I dropped the buffer light cruisers that were in B tier, namely Emden, Marseillaise, and Ido no Shiro. They're still okay, but Aurora is just so much more convenient to use, and there are good enough Ironblood and French ships going around that they're not that important even if you want to build a faction fleet. Once again, they're not worse now than they were before, but I don't feel the need to keep them in anymore. This is contrary to my battleship tier list though, but I feel that battleships are more impactful. I might change my mind on that when I make changes to the battleships tier list though. Now, I'll talk about the additions to B tier. First is the addition of Anshan and Changchun. I dropped them down to B tier as a consequence of Taiyuan dropping down to A tier to indicate that they're not as strong or flexible as Taiyuan, and are outclassed in most cases. They could also go to the bottom of A tier instead, where there is no real difference, but I wanted to have the B tier more populated than the A tier. Maybe what I could have done is put Anshan at the end of A and then Changchun at the start of B. After that is Watarase. Her damage is still pretty ridiculous, but you do have to use her with Musashi, and there's not much room for creativity. She's probably about as strong as Ibuki and Shimakaze, but due to how she's pretty much an extension of Musashi, I think she should lose some credit. I also reordered some of the B tier. I put St. Louis close to the DDGs, because she occupies the same niche, which is high damage against light armor, but slightly bulkier and less consistent. I still have to test her exact output against a light armor enemy though. I moved Neptune under Felix, because they pretty much do the same thing, but Felix has anti-submarine capabilities as well. Let's now move on to A tier. The only addition is Taiyuan because Hindenburg deals the same amount of damage as her against light armor, is a bit bulkier, and also deals the highest damage against medium armor as well. Mogador is also close to Taiyuan in damage, a little bit on the lower side, but offers a ton of utility with her stab and invulnerability, making her a great choice both as a tank and against heavy armor bosses, despite her theoretical shortcomings as a purely gun-focused destroyer. Therefore, I think it is appropriate to have Taiyuan in a tier lower than those two, although, once again, the bottom of S tier and the top of A tier is not really that much of a difference. I also switched the order of Ibuki and Shimakaze because Shimakaze is too fast, so I would rather use Ibuki on auto most of the time, not to mention her extra survivability. The last change in A tier is moving Kronstadt behind Bayard and Brest. Her damage is lower than that of Bayard, and her survivability is lower than that of Brest. Along with her lack of healing means that I value the other two over her. While I did test her against Neptune and found that Neptune is essentially the same as her, both on the damage and survivability ends, in 13.4, I used plus 10 equipment, which is better for Neptune as she is more reliant on her barrages, while Kronstadt is more reliant on her guns, and Kronstadt would also deal more single target damage due to having more targeted damage. You can use Kronstadt in a solo boss fight like Meta Showdown or Operation Siren bosses, but I wouldn't recommend trying Neptune there. By the way, Z52's damage calculations were downwardly adjusted, about the same as Plymouth's across the three armor types, winning against heavy by about as much as losing against light. While she's not as ahead of everyone as she was before, it still stands that she's better than Plymouth in almost all situations, save for certain light armor bosses, where Plymouth could end up contributing a bit more damage. The final changes are in the to-be-determined tier. Although I'm not very interested in Fargo and Hum on 2 anymore, with the addition of Z52, who occupies a similar role to them but a million times better, so I'll likely just drop them altogether. If Z1's buff makes enough of a difference to Z52's performance, she might have a chance to make it in. And I'll also test Momo and Nana after I'm done raising Z52. For now though, I'll just say that Momo's plant summons massively slow down suicide ships that run into them, and is a huge help for interception in Chapter 14, and likely Chapters 10 and 11 as well, but I haven't done them in a long time. One last thing, if you don't know how to access the tier list, go to the tier list maker site linked in the description, and then click on this up arrow, which is the import button, and then you can find the 3 tier lists here. Okay, that's it for this tier list update. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.